Sneha, am I audible? Sneha, please let me know if I'm audible. Okay, great. Um, Welcome back, everyone, to the second session of the day, and let me introduce our second plenary speaker. Meenu Susan Koshy is an assistant professor in English, Marthoma College for Women, affiliated to Mahatma Gandhi University, Kerala. She received her doctorate from FLU Hyderabad for her thesis on a comparative study of post-colonial domestic in the works of Mario Vargas Llosa and Mukundan. She has authored a book titled Narrating Childhood Trauma, The Quest for Catharsis, and has two other books in the pipeline. She is the translator of Tattoo, an award winning collection of short stories, and the editor of Gossamer Reveries. She has also been a member of the several prestigious editorial boards, including the 17th International Film Festival of Kerala and the Journal of Global South Studies, State University of New York. Her areas of interest include cultural studies, post-colonial studies, comparative and world literature. Minu has also been a very, very old friend of mine, and she has inspired me as a researcher with her dedication to her work. And she is going to speak on the diseased nation and its discontent, reading the epidemic body and the politics of non-belonging in India. Over to you, Minu.
Thank you for the warm note of introduction, Oindri. So I feel really privileged to have been invited by my friend of over almost a decade, Dr. Roindri Roy, to this session. I thank all the members of the Department of English, Gokhale Memorial College, for having invited me and also for having chosen a unique topic that is of relevance in the global scenario today. So, as Oindri mentioned, my paper is titled The Deceased Nation and Its Discontents, Reading the Epidemic Body and the Politics of Non-Belonging in India. The paper is divided into four segments. The first one dealing with nationalism and governmentality during epidemics in India, and the second one talking about hierarchies of belonging or non-belonging, and the third one about biopolitics and the objectification of the human body, especially during time of the pandemic. And finally, the conclusion. I would take about 30 to 40 minutes of your time, so please bear with me. To begin, um, we'll be dealing with nationalism and governmentality during epidemics in India. Epidemics have been spectacles of extreme suffering and fear, with the terror of ostracization and abjection, to quote Julia Kristeva, especially by the state machinery and the civil society, being more pronounced than the fear of actually being affected by the disease. The actual and imagined disease has been noticed to have shaped various strains of nationalism, with some promoting social cohesion and some propagating sectarian divisions within the nation. During the 19th century, when nationalist movements, popularly considered a natural corollary of the anti colonial movement, gained ground, the colonized people were in a quest for unifying factors that could hold the masses together. Often, in many locales, actual diseases or the memory of such diseases served as sources of cohesion, especially so when the state machinery, the colonial state machinery, worsened the crisis by treating the colonized people as disposable bodies or by adopting high handed containment measures. This was especially conspicuous in colonial India during the 19th century, when plague and cholera spread across the world, with India being one of the worst affected countries. The period from 1896 to 1918 witnessed the death of about 10 million Indians affected by the plague wave which had reached India from Hong Kong in 1896. In order to prevent the disease from spreading, the British authorities took stringent measures without consulting the people and, more importantly, without consulting any of the religious communities. For instance, in Pune, the military was employed by Walter Charles Rand, the assistant collector and chairman of the Pune Plague Committee, to check houses and to detect and isolate plague patients. He was appointed at a time when thousands of people were fleeing Pune in fear of the plague, and some of them were hiding dead bodies, hiding people inside their houses in order to prevent detection by the police. So the state, the colonial state, the moment it realized that the situation was going out of control, the moment it realized that its systems would be affected, they decided to put a military regime in place, and that is how Rand, who was known to be an authoritarian kind of person, was appointed as the chairperson of the Pune Plague Committee. Now, he knew no mercy when it came to tracking and isolating patients or potential patients. The soldiers adopted high handed measures, entering houses by force and destroying domestic possessions and even looting houses under the guise of cleaning up and fumigating the premises. Now, we must remember that the British soldiers who entered were mostly Christian. The entry of these British soldiers into the inner sphere of the house highly infuriated the people of India, and especially when they entered the puja rooms and the kitchen, which were considered extremely sacred by the Indians. This was perceived as a direct attack on the religion and the private life of the colonized people. Women were forced to come out of their houses to be inspected for plague symptoms by male British officers. In a country where religion and culture dictated that women stay within the domestic sphere, away from the public gaze, this was construed as a violation of their modesty and an assault on the agency and masculinity of the male head of the family. Now, considering that nationalism was slowly gaining ground at that time, and the body of the woman was a potent site where the politics of nationalism was being played out, with the woman being the symbol of the pure Indian nation. This was construed of as an absolute violence, not just on the woman's body, but also on the body of the nation as a whole. Now, besides the autopsies of the dead bodies of people affected by the plague further infuriated the people, as it is prohibited by Indian religious beliefs, both Hindu and Muslim. The search and segregation operations were outrageous to the Indians and invited deep resistance from the Orthodox Indian public sphere. Besides, the Western systems of medicine were still viewed with suspicion by a majority of Indians. We have all heard stories of how people used to run away when the British officials came with medicines for vaccination. This was viewed with suspicion by a society which strongly believed that epidemics like smallpox or plague were caused by divine the anger of the gods. Okay, so in such a situation, the Western systems of medicines were almost aberrant to the Indian public. The authorities failed to take into consideration the religious sentiments of the people, who took the measures as a violent intrusion into their private lives. In an immensely religious country like India, this had severe consequences, with Rand being ultimately assassinated in 1896, 1 year after his appointment as the chairman of the Plague Commission. Nationalists like Bal Gangadhar Tilak had openly criticized the plague administration of the colonial authorities, further fueling nationalist sentiments. The imposition of measures to control the epidemic without taking the sentiments of the affected people into consideration played a major role in unifying the masses against the colonial authorities. Epidemics were also used by the West as tools of denigrating Asia, and the racialized language such as Asian cholera or Indian cholera was used to refer to the epidemic, pointing to how the colonial situation was much similar to the condition today when we hear racialized language being used to refer to the coronavirus. You hear it being referred to as a Tabliki Jamaat virus, you hear it as being referred to as a Chinese virus. So the racialized language was in existence whenever there was an epidemic. The hierarchy of belonging or the question of who belonged and did not belong surfaced through the use of language like this. Indian pilgrimages were held squarely responsible for the spread of the disease to the west. A paper titled Oriental Pilgrimages and Cholera, published in 1892 by William Eggleston, says, I quote, from the earliest history of the disease, whenever it has entered any country outside India, cholera could be traced back to its home in Bengal. Unquote. The paper labels the cholera outbreaks of 1841 and 1843 as the Juggernaut epidemic and the Haridwar epidemic, respectively, holding the religious festivals at Puri and Haridwar responsible for the spread of the disease. The paper refuses to take into consideration any other possible reasons, objectifying Asians and their cultural aspects, especially religion, as his concluding statements reveal. He says,
Meenu, we are
the
sorry
main
to
proven cause.
interrupt you. Meenu, can you hear me? I'm sorry to
Yeah, yes,
interrupt.
yes, Ovindra.
There's a problem with the audio at your end, I believe. So could you just,
Mm.
if you can try removing the headphone and unplugging the headphone from your laptop, is that possible?
Is it audible now?
Yes, it's a lot better now. It's a lot better
Better
now.
now? Oh,
Yes.
all right.
Could you just,
I will.
go ahead with like, speak about the other points that you just mentioned, sum them up, and then move on to the rest of it because we have been
All right.
receiving
Yeah.
a lot of issues about the audio not being clear. Okay.
Okay.
Receiving a lot of messages.
So,
Okay. So this is a
right.
lovely
I
topic actually. We have also received comments about this being a very important topic and a very relevant topic and people very. So if you could just recapitulate the points that you just said and then go ahead.
yeah. Sure. I'm
Yeah.
clear now,
Thank you.
right?
Yeah, you are audible now.
Oh, okay. So I was talking about the colonial context when cholera and plague broke out in India. Now I was saying that epidemics and the epidemic body have always been objects of abjection, to quote Julia Kristeva, especially when people are afraid more of being affected by the disease or the possibility of being affected by the disease than by actually getting affected. So during the 19th century, when nationalism was at its peak, it has been noticed that epidemics often gave rise to various streams of nationalism, with some promoting social cohesion and some promoting separatist trends. Now, the colonial authorities adopted high-handed measures to contain cholera and plague. So I talked about the period from 1896 to 1918, when around 10 million people, 10 million Indians passed away due to the plague wave which reached India via Hong Kong. In order to prevent this disease from spreading, the British authorities took stringent measures and appointed an authoritarian officer called Walter Charles Rand as the assistant commissioner of Pune, which was the worst affected place. He was also appointed as the chairman of the plague committee. He was checking the houses. I mean, he was entrusted with the task of checking houses and isolating plague patients. The soldiers adopted high-handed measures, often entering the houses wearing shoes, which was anathema to the traditional orthodox-minded Indian public. Now, we must remember that most of these people were Christians. The soldiers who entered were mostly Christian men, and their entry into the sacred space of the puja room or the kitchen was considered sacrilege by the Indians. This was perceived as a direct attack on the religion, beliefs, and the private lives of the colonized people. Now, this was a time at which nationalism was at its peak. So, the nationalist movement found in the woman's body a potent site where the Indian identity, which was modern yet very different from the Western modernity, could be depicted. So, as such, an attack on the woman's body, when a woman was asked to come out into the public gaze to be inspected for plague symptoms by male officers, this was considered as an attack on the masculinity of the Indian man, as well as a direct attack on the Indian nationalist movement as a whole. The sacred body of the woman was defiled by the Western officers, according to the Indian. The Indian response to this was highly problematic in the sense that this infuriated the people who uh, who were already highly fed up with the British administration. Now, the autopsies were another cause of concern. Hinduism and Islam forbids autopsies. Now, the cutting off of the body after death caused another set of trouble for the British people, with people reacting violently out on the streets. Now, the search and segregation operations carried out within the houses were invited deep resistance from the Indian public. And we must also remember that at this time, the Western systems of medicine were viewed with suspicion. As I said earlier, people used to run away when the doctors came with medicines for vaccination, and there was a strong belief that epidemics were caused by the anger of the gods. So, treating the epidemic with Western medicine invited a lot of censure because people were basically suspicious of the Western systems. Now, the authorities did not consult the religious leaders or the communities, and then they went ahead with repressive measures, which further fueled nationalist sentiments. Now, ultimately, Rand, the commissioner, the chairperson of the commission, was assassinated 1 year after his appointment in 1897. Now, nationalists like Tilak criticized the British for their plague administration, and on the whole, the plague administration was quite high-handed and repressive, and it had severe consequences in the public domain. Now, epidemics were used by the West to denigrate Asia and especially India. So just like we see now people talking about the Tabliki Jamaat virus, we see like people talking about the Chinese virus using racialized language to refer to the COVID-19 situation. So we see that even during the colonial times, the disease was used as a way of creating a racialized other. Now, in a paper written by a Western scholar called William Eggleston, it is written that from the earliest history of the disease, cholera has been associated with India. Now, it was traced back to his home in Bengal. Now, there are no other possibilities considered. There is an arbitrary statement made that the pilgrimages from India, especially the one at Puri and Haridwar, caused the epidemics and spread the epidemics to the west. These epidemics were termed as a Juggernaut epidemic and a Haridwar epidemic. Okay, so pointing to giving the notion that all these India is quietly responsible for the spread of the epidemic to the west, thereby posing a threat to the hygienic, within quotes, hygienic west. Now, the paper refuses to take into consideration any of the other reasons, thus objectifying Asians and their cultural aspects, especially the religion. His concluding statements are quite interesting. He says, it is beyond human possibility to put India in good sanitary condition in any reasonable time, and to make the pilgrims observe the commonest rules of hygiene and cleanliness would require 2 soldiers for each pilgrim. The most riotous imagination could scarcely exaggerate the filth of India and Egypt and of the Hindu and Mohammedan pilgrims. So long as the pilgrimages continue, Europe and this country will be endangered. You can look at how the civilizing mission of the West was projected as a necessity if the world was to be saved even from diseases. It is interesting to note that the author emphasizes on the religion of the people involved. Hindus and Muslims are projected as the unhygienic other to the sophisticated Western Christian subject. The religion of the other has always been utilized as a means of targeting subjects during times of epidemics, as current discourses also reveal. Through emphasis on the pilgrimage routes as a means of the spread of cholera, Eggleston highlights how religious practices in the Orient are fundamentally, within quotes, unhealthy and unhygienic, thereby attacking the intensely personal sphere of the Oriental subject. The Orient is projected as a threat to the hygienic West, as a polar opposite to all that the Occident was believed to stand for. Newspapers and journals were used to propagate the message, much like the situation today, thereby leading to the objectification of Asia, especially India. The dichotomy between the East and the West was thus reinforced through cultural discourses centered on epidemics. These are just 2 instances where epidemics came to possess political significance, triggering nationalist sentiments and leading to ostracization of the affected or potentially affected bodies, transforming them into objects of disgust. The adoption of stringent measures to curb the spread of the epidemic in India and the attacks launched on the infected subjects and areas through the media and popular culture succeeded in creating distorted images of the geographic and the religious other, leading to ostracization at multiple levels. The deceased nation was projected as a threat to the West. The state machinery, through its inhuman modes of identifying, treating, and labeling subjects affected by cholera or plague, was used to perpetuate the spread of the epidemic. made them more vulnerable to public disaffection, creating a class of people unable to make their presence felt in the public arena due to fear of being censured. The prejudices that existed in the Indian society further accentuated the objectification of lower class and lower caste subjects who were believed to be unhygienic and who were even in normal times considered as health risks. This enabled the colonizers' agenda of creating a divided Indian society to gain political mileage. Over the years, the state machinery in India has utilized brute power to bring deceased bodies under control, especially when those bodies were of the subjects who did not belong totally to the nation. The legal provisions to tackle epidemics, systematized by the colonial authorities in the form of the Epidemics Diseases Act 1897, which granted power to the state to take special measures during epidemics. These kind of institutions were utilized conveniently by the state to operationalize systems of stringent surveillance and punishments to bring dissenting bodies under control, thereby entrenching disciplinary mechanisms and creating consent among the subjects to being ruled. The epidemic outbreaks post 1947, such as the Spanish flu, the Surat plague, and the novel COVID 19 situation, stand testimony to this argument. Foucault's notion of governmentality finds potent ground in the arena of politics during the times of epidemics. The biopolitical and the sovereign juridical forms of power work in tandem to curb and control diseases and bring disposable, within quotes, bodies within state control, shaping a nation state that utilizes a medical pole as a fundamental axis around which nationalism and the politics of inclusion and exclusion are centered. Epidemics provided the perfect venue for the state machinery to exert control over the bodies of the subjugated subjects, utilizing medical institutions and the state apparatus as tools to create consent to being governed. Coming to the second part, where I deal with the diseased nation and the question of non belonging. The question of belonging is a pivotal one in any scrutiny of the nation and nationalism, especially so when we consider extra everyday situations such as nationalism and nationality during epidemics, when scarce resources are to be distributed optimally among the population. The nation, stricken by an epidemic or pandemic, transforms into Foucauldian heterotopia, a counter site where, I quote, all the other real sites that can be found within the culture are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted, unquote. Even while the nation, as an imagined community, attempts to function for the welfare of its citizens, the crisis often becomes a convenient justification for the entrenchment of hierarchies within the social order through preferential treatment for some group and negligence towards the other. Belonging is a two-dimensional phenomenon. It's both an ongoing and performed act of functioning in normative modes in a network of effective and performative markers such as loyalty, commitment, and a shared sense of nationhood, as also a fixed concept evidenced by formal proofs of citizenship. Belonging to a nation implies that the subject is at home there, while non belonging implies a sense of alienation and displacement. While former markers of belonging, the most significant one being citizenship, validate the existence of a certain group of subjects within a nation, this does not automatically mean them being at home in their locale with rights with access to all the facilities and rights granted to its so-called citizens. Hierarchies of belonging exist, whereby some groups belong more than others to the nation by virtue of various factors such as religion, race, class, or caste. Those who are perceived to belong totally are provided freer access to resources than those who belong less. This is nowhere more evident than in the case of nations turned into crisis heterotopias, where the entire nation becomes a space of isolation and quarantining, sometimes by force. The Indian notion of nationalism and national identity has always been fraught with complications from the very beginning of the nationalist movement, with religion, caste, and class being major markers of identity. The very process of the creation of the Indian state was predicated on the notion of religion being a prominent marker of national identity, with Pakistan being created as the Islamic counterpart to a secular India. The nationalist movement itself was dominated by religious and caste concerns as the formation of various nationalist movements and organizations revealed. Even within the so-called Secular International Congress, caste and class played a major role in determining roles and positions. As a corollary, it can be argued that belonging to India entails the question of how much does one belong, as a hierarchy of belonging is determined by multiple factors, with the most prominent one being religion, the same factor that promoted the growth of right wing in India with it promotes a severely saffronized nationalism. Class factors also assume prominence in determining who belongs and who does not. The poor and the internally displaced often bear the brunt of epidemics, and state interventions fail to ameliorate their situation in any way, as a recent incidents in India reveal. When the nation turns into a crisis heterotopia, especially for the subaltern during an epidemic, the question of belonging often gets affiliated to one's allegiance or non allegiance to the ideology of the state, as is evident from the colonial and post colonial epidemic situations. While the colonial government ensured the protection of British officials, as also the pro colonial urban elite, the pro independence governments ensured the safety of communities which they perceived of as belonging to the nation. The groups at the lowest rungs of the hierarchy of belonging were totally excluded from the ambit of relief and rehabilitation measures. All right. So, coming to the third part, which is the core area of my study, um, wasted bodies in pandemic India, biopolitics, and the objectified non belonging other. The process of objectification of the non belonging other, who gradually comes to be considered as waste to be disposed of, becomes significant here. Waste is that which is useless, an entity which has surpassed its utility period, or that which is in excess. It has always been considered as an element to be tamed if the social order is to remain civilized and contained or tamed. Othering functions through a subtle or overt process of trashing or deeming waste entire groups of people deemed useless or excess to the nation, entities to be eliminated or brought under control if the nation is to remain civilized. The objectification or making abject of the subaltern often entails the creation of disgust towards their bodies, which are presented as smelly, dirty, and unhygienic, as opposed to the clean, healthy body of the belonging majority. Martha Nussbaum, in From Disgust to Humanity, argues societies have felt a strong disgust towards many people and practices, including members of the lower castes and classes, foreigners, people with disabilities, people with physical deformities. Disgust is then extended from object to object. This sort of extended disgust is what I call projective disgust. Projective disgust is shaped by social norms. All societies identify at least some humans as very disgusting. Very likely, this is a stratagem adopted to cordon off the dominant group more securely from its own feared animality. If those quasi humans stand between me and the world of disgusting animality, then I am that much further from being mortal, decaying, smelly, or oozy myself. Unquote. By projecting the non belonging other as disgusting, the dominant majority projects itself as clean and hygienic, and hence deserving of autonomy and of a larger share in the nation's resources. Those who do not belong, or those who belong less, are stigmatized through the projection of feelings of disgust onto them by associating primary objects of disgust, such as saliva or fecus or even the virus, with them. The targeting of Muslims who attended the Tabliki Jamaat meeting at Nizamuddin Markaz as the carriers of the coronavirus is precisely such an attempt at stigmatizing the already marginalized minority. Here, it is significant to remember that the lockdown in India was announced at a time when protests against the fundamentally discriminatory and anti Muslim Citizenship Amendment Act were flaming. The coronavirus came in handy at two levels. First, it shifted attention away from the Citizenship Amendment Act Act or the CAA, and second, it validated the government's position regarding the nation's minorities. The move for the National Population Register, combined with the CAA, was irrefutably an attempt at classifying people as citizens and non citizens on the basis of religion, determining their location at the hierarchies of belonging. The Tabliki Jamaat incident was popularized by national media as well as by the state to demonize Muslims, labeling them as willful carriers of the virus, much like the Nazis accusing Jews of having been the spreaders of typhus during the rise of the Third Reich. The virus was even given the communalized name Tabliki Jamaat virus, thereby creating the impression that the disease originated there, although news of the equally large Hindu gathering at Haridwar and the Sikh gathering at Maharashtra were conveniently forgotten. The meeting was projected as an attempt at Corona Jihad, whatever that means, and communal forces were quick to circulate fake news over the internet about Muslims deliberately spreading the virus. The video of a Muslim fruit seller spitting on mangoes, photos of Muslim men praying in groups in mosques, and other images from past years were circulated as images from the lockdown period, thus villainizing Muslim subjects. There were exhortations to boycott Muslim traders and hospitals denied treatment to Muslim subjects. Even as recently as yesterday, there was a news of Muslim students being asked to sit separately during exams conducted in various parts of India. An entire community was objectified and their bodies projected as disgusting by the state, supported by the mainstream national media. The propagation of the video of the man spitting on the fruits and hospitals denying treatments to Muslim patients also point to how the body and bodily fluids of the subaltern subject, who is located at the lower rungs of the hierarchy of belonging, are projected as threats to the hygienic majority. The projected disgust served to distance the belonging communities of the nation from the filth and disease brought in by the virus. This is particularly evident when we examine the response of the media to the Sikh and Hindu pilgrims stranded at Maharashtra and Haridwar, respectively. While provisions were made for them by the state to be taken back to their hometowns, the attendees of the Tabliki Jamaat were stranded in Delhi for days, making them the target of communally fueled propaganda. The tests on the Sikh and Hindu pilgrims were less compared to those on the Tabliki Jamaat attendees, and naturally, the numbers revealed that a large number of the latter had contracted COVID 19. While the groups which the nation considers its own were spared the stigmatization, the already vilified Muslims were further objectified by the state machinery. Besides, the portrayal of the minority community as spreaders of the disease served the communal agenda of promoting a persecution complex in the majority groups, thus validating the communal fantasies of the state. The organic link between non belonging and the politics of disgust becomes evident yet again in the case of migrants in contemporary India during the corona crisis. Migrants have long been hidden conveniently in the shadows by successive governments eager to advertise India as a shining global power. The image of the barely clothed, sweating, dirty migrant was deliberately hidden from the global media in the state's attempt to promote the image of a developed India. Pushed to the very peripheries of the social order, the migrants within the country have been eking out a living with meager salaries received for hazardous and arduous work. The question of whether they belong to the nation or not became more complicated in the wake of the CAA and the NPR, which demanded that they prove their citizenship. Further objectified by their poverty and inability to provide formal proof of belonging, internal migrants were the objects of humiliation and harassment long before the pandemic reached India. With the arrival of the coronavirus, the quote, filthy, unhygienic migrants came to be depicted as potential carriers of the disease, propelling employers and the social order as a whole to ostracize them, making them what Kristeva terms the abject entity to be radically excluded, to be from all kinds of belonging within the nation. In many cities across India, migrant laborers traveling to their home states were sprayed with chemical disinfectants to prevent them from so-called spreading the coronavirus. The non-belonging subject here, the poor, filthy migrant walking for miles and miles on the roads, is perceived as a threat to the belonging groups who are to be quarantined safely inside their houses. The objectification of the laborer becomes conspicuous in the pictures which show the police and health officials directing horses filled with bleeding agents at them. They are dehumanized and presented as objects of suspicion, whose bodies are to be brought under state control through biopolitical means. The World Bank, in its report titled COVID 19 through a Migration Lens, states that 40 million internal migrants have been affected by the lockdown announced by the Indian government. The sudden lockdown, imposed without adequate planning, plunged millions of migrant workers into utter misery, with employers firing them overnight, leaving them to starve on the streets. In the absence of adequate means of transport, they began walking to their hometowns thousands of miles away, often perishing due to starvation and thirst. The absolute indifference of the state machinery to their misery is nowhere more evident than in the response of the Supreme Court to a plea filed by Advocate Alok Srivastava to provide food, water, and shelter to stranded migrant workers in the wake of the Aurangabad train accident, which killed 16 migrant workers who slept on a railway track out of pure exhaustion. The Supreme Court bench, headed by Justice L. Nageshwar Rao, dismissed the plea, saying, "How can anyone stop this when they sleep on the railway tracks?" And stating further that it was impossible for the court to monitor who was walking and who was not walking. Unquote. The response of the highest judicial body in the state, entrusted with the task of protecting and safeguarding the fundamental rights of the citizens of the country, point to how the state machinery perceives the internally displaced subjects as dispensable bodies of no import to the state or to the law. Migrants are reduced to what Agamben terms homo sacer, the sacred or the cursed man, life that cannot be sacrificed and yet may be killed. As Agamben says about the homo sacer, the migrants are outside human jurisdiction, beyond the reach of the law, subsumed by systemic violence. They can be persecuted and even killed by individuals or by the system without the fear of prosecution, as their life is disposable to the mainstream social order. The migrant life is located within the sovereign sphere where, I quote, "it is permitted to kill without committing homicide and without celebrating a sacrifice." Unquote. The word sacer, according to Alfred Mellay's etymological dictionary of the Latin language, designates the person or a thing that one cannot touch either without dirtying it or dirtying oneself, giving a double meaning to the term sacer or sacred. It could mean sacred or accursed. The migrant is such an ambiguous entity denoting contradictory meanings, sacred and at the same time accursed. He or she is sacred to the Indian nation in the sense that their presence is inevitable for the growth of the country, with migrant labor contributing around 10% of the Indian GDP. The rise of the nation as a global power is predicated on their work, which is mostly in the informal sector and by default on their exploitation. They are, at the same time, accursed and disposable owing to their poverty, filth, and dirtiness. They form the underbelly of the India shining on the global stage, and hence they are disposable. Indeed, they are to be discarded or hidden if the nation is to be projected as civilized enough as a building of walls to hide slums during the visit of the American president in 2020 revealed. The death of the migrant laborer, the homo sacer, thus becomes convenient to the state machinery once the utility value is over. Now, when the pandemic situation has made it evident that migrant labor will not be in demand for years to come, the figure of the laborer has has become that of the accursed, an entity that can be killed by anybody without fear of being punished. News of dead bodies of migrants who died of hunger in Shramik special trains, footage of poor laborers fighting for packets of biscuits, pictures of children sleeping on suitcases as they are being dragged along by their parents, desperately seeking to reach home, and the indifference, the absolute indifference of the state towards these subjects point to the modes in which the politics of non-belonging works. Special trains carrying migrant workers seemingly lost their way and reached stations hundreds of kilometers away from their original destination, causing abject misery to the passengers. The railway ministry cited congestion issues as the reason, an unbelievable claim given that on any normal day the railway operates more than double this traffic. That the government could get away with such claims portrays how the media, as well as the citizens, have turned indifferent to the plight of subjects located at the lower rungs of the hierarchies of belonging, the homo sacer who can be killed with impunity. Another segment of the population, viewed with extreme contempt during the pandemic, is a returning diasporic population who, even earlier, had occupied an ambiguous position in the hierarchy of belonging. The Indian nation, although dependent to a large extent on foreign remittances, had viewed the migrant population with suspicion, often suspecting their loyalties, especially so when they possessed dual citizenship. During the COVID 19 situation, the diasporic population who returned from the Gulf countries, as well as from Europe, were treated with disgust as the potential carriers of the disease. The innumerable trolls which circulated about the returning migrants bringing the coronavirus with them stands testimony to how they are viewed by the civil society. The government adopted a very ambiguous stance, providing and withdrawing permission for flights alternately. It was after much pressure from outside and inside that the state finally consented to bringing the stranded Indians back home under the Vande Bharat mission. The fares, which are exorbitant, were paid by the travelers themselves. It is to be noted that the people who returned were mostly people who had lost their jobs in the wake of the pandemic. The state's attempt at delaying and complicating their return was again an attempt at maintaining a distance from the abject other who could threaten the belonging population of India. The attitude of the state was reflected in that of the common people towards expatriates. The news of their return was greeted by opposition from various quarters. In the wake of COVID 19, Foucault's notion of biopower and governmentality have become particularly significant. In Right of Death and Power Over Life, he delineates two forms of the sovereign power over life which appeared after the 17th century: the anatomopolitics of the human body, that is, its disciplining and the optimization of its capabilities, and then, more importantly, the biopolitics of the population. I quote, it focuses on the species body, the body imbued with the mechanics of life and serving as a basis of the biological processes, propagation, births and mortality, the level of health, life expectancy, and longevity. Supervision was effected through an entire series of interventions and regulatory controls. Unquote. The functioning of biopolitics becomes very conspicuous during epidemics, which fundamentally affect the body and its biological mechanisms. Foucault highlights the outbreak of the plague as a vital moment when new techniques and technologies of power came into being. During the plague, the city was divided into multiple smaller units, each supervised by a government official. Surveillance was strict, mobility was curbed, movements of the subjects, both deceased and healthy, were to be supervised. Foucault remarks about how discipline and disciplinary tools were consolidated as a response to plague. The plague is met by order. Its function is to sort out every possible confusion, that of the disease, which is transmitted when bodies are mixed together, that of the evil, which is increased when fear and death overcome prohibitions. There was also a political dream of the plague. Strict divisions, not laws transgressed, but the penetration of a regulation into each individual even the smallest details of everyday life through the mediation of the complete hierarchy that assured the capillary functioning of power. Unquote. The plague as a form of disorder had as its medical and political correlator in discipline. The disciplinary tools employed by the state to create docile bodies in a state of exception created by the plague gradually came to be normalized. Surveillance and the panoptic machinery came to be consolidated as governmental measures to bring population under control. The current pandemic also poses the same threat of bringing into being and consolidating novel forms of biopolitics and governmentality. During epidemics, the body acts as a locus around which governmentality revolves, and the state is endowed with the power to intervene, sometimes in arbitrary ways, under the guise of protection and medical assistance. The state propagates surveillance as a mandatory tool to protect the nation from the disease and deceased bodies, as evidenced by the Arogya Setu app, as evidenced by the 24/7 surveillance mechanism for COVID patients. The panoptic machinery works in full force today, as in the 17th century. As you can see how bodies are kept under quarantine, and GPS systems are put in place to track them. We observe an indirect correlation between belonging and surveillance, with those who belong less being under higher surveillance. The widespread and rigorous testing of the Muslims who attended the Tabliki Jamaat meeting, and the low rates of testing of the Sikh and Hindu pilgrims who gathered at around the same time makes this evident. The pandemic has also provided a convenient cover for the suppression of dissent by providing the state unlimited power over the bodies and movements of subjects. There is no possibility of citizens gathering to protest against any kind of injustice owing to the lockdown. The strict surveillance mechanism ensures absolute obedience to the state. Besides, law enforcing bodies are functioning at minimal capacity, and the mainstream media, which has anyway been compromised, has found in the pandemic a convenient cloud behind which to hide other issues. As such, those deemed dangerous to the nation have been targeted and persecuted by the nation. The most conspicuous instances being the imposition of the draconian Unlawful Activities Prevention Act 1967 on activists, journalists, and student protesters who have, for the past few years, been at the very bottom of the hierarchy of belonging, having been termed anti-nationals, those who are against the nation or those who belong outside the nation by, within quotes, choice. The case of Safura Sargar, who is in the second trimester of her pregnancy and kept in solitary confinement in the name of quarantine, points to how the body of the non-belonging and dissenting subject becomes a target of governmentality. By targeting the already weakened body of a pregnant woman at a time when protests are more or less impossible, the state machinery has proven how states of exception can be utilized to bring dissenting bodies under control even when normalcy returns. The pandemic has led to widespread crushing of democratic and constitutional rights, which might continue into the post-pandemic period as well, something about which we must be very careful. The pandemic has also highlighted the systemic injustice that values some lives over others. In society must be defended. Foucault asserts that racism is, I quote, a way of introducing a break between what must live and what must die, unquote. Extending this argument to any form of non-belonging, it can be said that the degree of belonging determines who deserves protection from the epidemic and who does not. Biopolitical governmentality relies on what Lorenzini calls differential exposure and differential vulnerability to health risks. In India, with its multiple strands and hierarchies of belonging and non-belonging, biopolitical governmentality endows the state with the power to decide whose life is valuable and whose is not. The pandemic has foregrounded this power in its most brutal form, where the upper class population, with the privilege of sitting at home and working, with the privilege of social distancing by virtue of its material and cultural capital, and the belonging majority are valued over those who belong less to the nation. We must also keep in mind that the non-belonging groups are often denied access to health care owing to their poverty, making the situation more precarious. The neoliberal order, which had already weakened social security systems and the rights of the underprivileged, found its most virulent expression during the pandemic in states like Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh, where labor laws were suspended to increase capital inflow and to promote investment. Such measures have further affected the poorest sections of the society for whom scarce, if any, relief measures have been provided. The impact of such acts would be the further peripheralizing of subjects already considered the nation's outcasts. The body of the worker becomes an abject entity with no rights in the post pandemic nation. As in the case of disciplinary mechanisms, the pandemic also brings with it new modes of non belonging through suspended labor rights, increased significance accorded to online education in a nation characterized by a glaring digital divide, and promotion of private and corporate entities at the cost of the lower caste, lower class, gendered subject, further subordinizing her or him. New belonging subjects are born, feudal systems emerge in new novel forms, the nation as a whole becomes diseased, both literally and metaphorically, gradually transforming into one where the state provides arbitrary definitions of belonging to suit its political agenda, as the CAA has demonstrated. Non belonging subjects are labeled disgusting and dangerous, and hence not to be integrated with the nation. Coming to the concluding part, non belonging and objectification constitute a vicious cycle with one leading to and rising from the other. The non belonging, abject other is systematically reduced to the level of an object with human qualities. Martin Buber's explication of the ish-2 and ish-s dichotomy becomes significant here. The relationship between the belonging I and the non belonging you becomes a subject object relationship. The other is no longer the confronted thou, but the experienced it. The relationship of the mainstream with the non belonging subject is one where the latter is experienced as a source of disease and filth. The Muslim subjects, migrants, the returning diasporic population all become objects against which the mainstream can define itself as clean and hygienic and hence better integrated with the nation. Even though the former might once have belonged, as in the case of the migrants, they gradually undergo a transition to the level of an it, where they are dehumanized. This follows the same logic as waste. Susan Gill, in From the Cult of Waste to the Trash Heap of History, asserts, I quote, materials are not born to be waste. They are transformed into waste by identifiable material and social processes. Unquote. The migrant, the Muslim, and the diasporic subject, as well as other non-belonging subjects, are transformed into their current state of dispossibility through social and historical processes, one of which is crisis in the form of epidemics and illness. The body affected by or potentially affected by the disease is transformed into filth and trash, and the subject in possession of the abject body becomes a dangerous S or it to be experienced as a source of disease. India, post COVID, is prone to undergo radical transformations in terms of the modes in which its others are perceived. The pandemic has served to widen and entrench existing hierarchies of belonging, with some groups being more Indian than others. Considering the radical fall in the Indian economy and the parochial agenda of the state, hierarchies of belonging are bound to be more visible in post pandemic India, with bodies, both epidemic and healthy, being projected as diseased at multiple levels to suit political agendas. The ish do bonds that existed prior to the pandemic are already mutating into ish s relationships, with the state mediating between subjects and objects, determining who belongs and who does not. Novel forms of nationalism and governmentality, often bordering on dictatorship using populist biopolitics, are inevitable in the post pandemic global economy scenario, bringing with them new notions of belonging and non-belonging and the associated discontents. Thank you.
Thank you, Minu. Can you hear us?
Yes, 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 I can hear you. Yes.
Thank you so much for the presentation.
We have Dr. Fraser with us.
Yes, we do have Dr. Fraser with us, Professor Fraser with us. Ma'am, would you like to go first? Would you like to speak to?
Yes, what shall I say? I mean, you again have covered a huge ground going back to colonial times, and you've looked at the intrusion into the domestic sphere by colonial powers during times of epidemics. And I think right through your talk, you have brought us up to date to the migrant crisis in India and raised questions of otherness and belonging, which are so poignant now. And I think yours is a very courageous paper, speaking out as you do. A lot of people like you should be speaking out. And I'm sure many of us will agree you've done a very good job in highlighting the truth and the dangers of fascism that we face today across the world. Thank you. Built on human suffering because of a pandemic, and amplified by the situation, where you can get away during lockdown and clamp down on communities without detection, possibly. So I think these are dangerous times, and you've done well to show how there's a continuity, as history has shown us, when the democratic voice of people, when social inclusion are jeopardized and brushed aside as as attitudes that can be um, pertinent to society. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Fraser, for your kind words. Thank you very much.
Okay.
You're
So
welcome.
we do have a few questions from our participants. Shall we take them? Ma'am, with your
Sure.
permission, we will take them. So
Okay, so
this is
should I go with the questions?
yeah. I'll just go in PL and then you can come in next. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So this is Debanjan Mitra saying, how apt do you think is the Agamemnian notion of bare human in understanding the current situation of the marginal migrants? Also, how do you locate the notion of biogovernmentality and biogovernance?
Okay. So yeah, any pandemic or a disease, epidemic, anything that affects the human body brings into question, brings into foregrounds the question of bare life and qualified life. As I mentioned, the qualified life has during a pandemic in a nation like India with very scant resources, the qualified life is often given prominence over the bare life, as I have mentioned. The bare life becomes the subject of sovereign power, where their rights are denied and they become the carriers of the burden of the nation in the sense that they are made to work, they're made to bear the brunt of whatever is happening. Like in the case of the migrants, the migrant life is a bare life. While see, look at us sitting here. Doing a webinar in our enclosed spaces, we can afford to sit here. We can afford. There was this notion. I mean, there was this idea being circulated that all of us should develop a new talent after the lockdown. So we are the qualified life. We are the bio who can afford to sit at home and stay away from the bare life, which is indeed a danger to us and to the nation. Now, the question of bio-governmentality, I think I have addressed. Now, the state, now we need to be very careful about this concept of bio-governmentality in the post-pandemic period. Now, as I mentioned, there is a control exercised over the human body, just as in the colonial periods, and maybe in more radical ways, considering that we are moving into a situation where populism and fascism are becoming the norms rather than the exception. So, in such a situation, um, look at it. Look at what people across the world are saying about corona, about protection from the corona. They are talking about herd immunity. Herd immunity happens when a major segment of the population are are safe from the virus. But who is this major segment? The major segment is the young people, the people who have the resources to remain safe. So we are kind of privileging a certain kind of body. The state itself is privileging a certain kind of body over the other. The old people, the deceased people, they are left to die because they are the bare life. They are the weekend life who are of no use to the nation. Now, there is an increased centralization of power if you look at India. What is happening? The states are made to bear the brunt of certain central government policies because certain issues belong to the concurrent list. The concurrent list is, yeah, although the states, the union is taking the decision, sometimes the states are made to take the blame. Then there is an increased centralization of power, and it is a challenge to Indian federalism. The government is using the state is using, rather, the state, any kind of state, not necessarily the Indian state, it's using the pandemic as a way of exerting control over the bodies of the people whose population it wants to control. An open secret that there are some populations whose propagation has to be stopped if the nation is to be turned to a particular in a particular way. So the pandemic has come as a convenient excuse. Now, bio-governmentality also involves uh, the prohibition of movement across boundaries. Now, already America was planning to build a wall to prevent migrants. Now, other countries are building walls to prevent Americans from entering. That's a different issue. But then these borders will remain open, closed for a long time to come, again affecting countries such as India, which rely heavily on foreign remittances. Now there is a radical shift to right-wing politics, which is where surveillance is a norm. Okay, so the bio-governmentality and the imposition of surveillance and biopolitical tools are going to increase in the coming years, and we need to be cautious about such a situation.
Neha, would you go ahead?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Meena. I'd just like to thank you for this very thoughtful, insightful talk that you provided us today, and where we could just reassess our rights within the nation. It was very important, and I think it is something very necessary to talk about these things. And thank you so much. And I would also like to thank you for being the kind of voice to the so-called numerous others that you brought in within the kind of talk. You spoke about the diasporic returnees. Uh, you spoke about the migrant laborers. You spoke about the minority religious groups, and even the colonial Indians within British India. And I think it is very important that maybe when they cannot represent themselves, it becomes our duty to become a kind of a voice for them. And I would like to thank you for also kind of reminding us that our hearts must be our hearts must go out to all these marginalized groups that you have spoken about today, and how important it is for us to, dissent, how dissent must always be welcomed, and not only welcomed but allowed within the nation. So thank you for this, terrific talk, and I'd also like to thank my colleague, Dr. Oindri, for introducing us to such a terrific speaker. Thank you. Maybe
Okay,
we
can
could
we go on? Yeah.
yeah, we could take a few questions. The first is from my colleague Shubham Datta. He asks, as Agamemnon puts it, Homo sacer can be killed with impunity but not sacrifice. Homo sacers have no nation and no sense of belonging. But can a migrant labor be murdered with impunity?
Okay. See, in this, the migrant labor can be murdered in with impunity, in the sense that look at what is happening now. Murder is also is not about physically murdering a person through the use of a weapon. It is also the murder of, wasn't the train incident in Aurangabad murder? Wasn't it institutionalized violence and murder? Isn't it? Is it? No one came and killed them. No one came and used a weapon. But look at what happened. Is it that they died a natural? No, they died because of state policies. I mean, it is. We need to acknowledge that they died because they were stranded. They moved. The court says, who told them to move? Their necessity told them to move. They moved because there were no facilities made for these people. There were no facilities made for the people to move, reach home. In many states, the condition of the migrant laborers was pathetic. What else do you do? In such a situation, it is nothing but murder, where the systems of the state murder a person. In that sense, yes, the Homo sacer is murdered, is indeed murdered by the state with impunity. That's what I personally feel. Yeah.
Okay, I hope Shubham, Dr. Muni could answer your question. The second one that we have is from Saikat Chakrabarti. How much do you feel post-COVID world would be a complete shift from the supplies to asepsis concretized with the aid of legislation?
I
Would you
didn't
just
get
like
you.
me
Can
to
you
repeat?
repeat?
Yeah, sure. How much do you feel how much do you feel post-COVID world would be a complete shift from the supplies to asepsis concretized with the aid of legislation?
Uh, yeah. I had just finished with that. Yeah. So, post-COVID world would definitely use legislation and political bodies, lawmaking bodies as a tool to propagate the interests of the state. That is one thing that we need that we can be sure of. Now, even before, let's just take the situation in India. Even before the pandemic, legislations were used to categorize some people as a non-belonging other. Look at what happened in the case of Jammu and Kashmir, where an entire group of people were silenced by the power of legislation. Look at what happened with the CAA. Look at what happened with the National Population Register. So this we must remember that this is also happening at a time when all across the world there are populist governments, whether it is India or Brazil with Jair Bolsonaro, or it is Russia. So the populist governments have come to power in recent years, and they are enjoying a certain kind of popularity. So even before the pandemic, legislation was used as a tool to suppress minorities, to suppress dissent. Now, in the post-COVID world, when biopolitics has been using biopolitics as the means of protecting citizens, that's the image that we get when we listen to the news and hear, okay, the people who came from the Gulf countries are under surveillance. There are GPS trackers in their houses. We feel relieved. Okay, so at a time when the public itself is accepting this kind of surveillance, when the public itself believes that the state is doing it in support of it to protect them, obviously legislation would provide an additional tool. It will bolster the claims of the state. It will bolster the demands of the state to put in place a surveillance economy. For sure. And then, as I said, there is this corporatization. Now, look at what happened in UP. Labor laws were suspended, okay, and it was done by means of legislation. So, legislation also comes to support the state in its attempt to push to the peripheries the people who do not belong. Legislation will definitely be used as a tool in the coming years, and that is what we need to be cautious about.
Okay,
Okay,
thank you
there
so
is
much.
question in the WhatsApp. Oh, before I ask you the question, I must thank you for this paper. It was brilliant. I loved it. There are so many comments which are, praising the boldness with which you addressed it and also the sensitive way in which you address such an important topic. I would like to ask this question that has come to us from Rajat Shubhra Mondol. He's a doctoral research scholar. He's asking, seen through a Foucauldian lens, the current situation is clearly one example of a constellation in which elements of sovereignty, discipline, biopower, and biopolitics and governmentality are combined in uneven as well as geographically situated and rapidly shifting ways. We can begin with the basic rationality of biopower and with Foucault's triangle of sovereignty, discipline, and governmentality that he introduced in his famous 1978 lecture. Does biopower address the well being of a population in terms of making live and letting die?
Okay. Yes, biopolitics does address that question, but what we need to consider now is yes, it is in a way, in a kind of way, like I said, it's kind of determining who needs to live, who can live, and who cannot live. It's also about. Could you repeat the last phrase, the last one?
Yes. He asked, does biopower address the well being of a population in terms of making live and letting die?
Okay.
He's
Yes.
put that in quotes. Yes.
Mm, yeah. So yes, it as I said, it does address the issue. In this context, I wanted to point out what Agamben said at the beginning when this COVID-19 situation broke out. Agamben said, "This is just like a flu. You don't have to take it so seriously. This is just a surveillance mechanism." But later, it turned out to be something more serious than the flu. There needed to be this kind of a surveillance mechanism and treatment for the patients. So yes, it is an economy of making live and letting die. It is also a necessary kind of a situation. I mean, we cannot totally do away with this kind of a surveillance, but we must also remember that this making live and letting die, when you say that, you are also giving a sovereign power the right to make you live or let you die. You are giving someone else, a dangerous entity, the power of over your life. The state it does not always function to promote the needs of the minority. It functions to promote its own agenda. So why is it that the individual would want to give up their rights to live or die to the state? Now, not to say that these kind of mechanisms are not essential. Yes, they are essential, but we need to be cautious when we give arbitrary power to an abstract entity to decide whether we should live or not, or we should die or not. So that is where the issue arises. Where do we draw the border? Where do we draw the border between necessary biopolitics, so to say? Initially, Foucault conceived of it as a positive thing, for biopolitics. Now we need to draw the distinction between positive biopolitics and populist biopolitics, which is going to turn into a threat in the coming years. We should always be careful when we entrust rights to abstract entities. That is what I feel.
Thank you so much.
Do we, do
Do
we
we
have any
have
more
more
questions? Then
questions?
I would like to ask one. Do we have
Okay,
any
go
more
ahead.
questions? Otherwise, I would like to ask one. So this is kind of my question to you. So we have a lot of disciplinary tools at our disposal now in the pandemic situation, and you have talked about them. We are looking into various social narratives through those tools. My question to you is that what happens next? How are these tools normalized in the years to come?
Yes. Like I said, this is going to be the future if we are not careful. Now, the GPS in Kerala was the first state where the GPS system was put in place to track COVID patients and to trace their contacts. Okay. It was hugely applauded by the public, it was indeed a very good measure. That way, the containment became very easy. But now look at it, the next step would be to put these surveillance mechanisms on anyone who is deceased in the literal way or the metaphorical way. You have, in a way, granted permission to the state to surveil you, to put you under the camera. Now, there is also the Arogya Setu app. When it was introduced, I think in the first week itself, 10 million people downloaded it. Okay, and then there was pressure from all court. There were instances where two people were murdered in a village because they did not download the app and they were not using it, and these two happened to be Muslims. Okay, so this is a situation where the public itself has accepted surveillance techniques. Even the dissenters, they have felt, they've begun feeling that surveillance is essential. Now, this, of course, is going to be the future. And like I said, uh, now productivity is being emphasized over life. Okay, as the suspension of the labor laws reveal. Now, the suspension of rights over the worker's body. The worker is losing his own rights over his own body with state sanction. Okay, when the state itself permits this kind of a situation, of course, and people are supporting it. You have seen even activists saying that no, you cannot blame the government, you cannot blame the government because that is the situation now. Okay, this situation, when does this situation vanish? People say that, I mean, scientists say the corona is here to last for 2 to 5 years. So are we going to continue this surveillance techniques for the coming 2 to 5 years? Are we going to allow ourselves and our data to be leaked out for these 2 to 5 years? What will be the end result of all this? And what is the and now see, the centralization of power happened long before the corona survey came to India. There was a challenge to the federal structure as a whole, and it is going to continue because now you can see many of the states, when they are asked to give a decision, they have to wait for the sender's decision to come first. Okay, the sender has in a way consolidated a lot of powers, and the concurrent list is just a concurrent list in name, with the government, the state, the central government dominating over uh, many of the items presented in this list. This is going to be the future if we are not careful. Like I said, there will be a shift to right wing politics, which fundamentally rests on the premise of the surveillance of non belonging citizens. The thing about right wing politics is they have a clear notion of who belongs and who does not, who are the nation's insiders and who are its outcasts. So, this kind of an attitude will definitely be promoted. Uh, the most important thing is, like Gramsci says, hegemony functions when you yourself give consent to being governed. The same thing would happen. You yourself are giving consent to being under surveillance. You yourself are giving consent to being marginalized at some level. So obviously, this when this becomes the future, that is when fascism would take root in its full splendor.
Do we have any more questions? Here?
I don't really.
There is, I think, one question that we can still take. Can we still take one more question, Henry?
One more question, and maybe we can come back.
Okay. Okay, this is from Shilpi Bhome. She writes, aren't we really building a post-COVID world on the carcasses of the poor, the non-belonging groups, and those who still have the courage to raise their voice against the injustice happening around?
Yes, that was exactly my point. We are building a post-COVID world, like she put it in perfect words, on the carcasses of the poor. The some of the images that would never leave our minds when we think about this period is that of a child trying to drink milk from from the mother when the mother was lying dead. Is that another picture is that of the rotis scattered on the railway tracks when the 16 migrants were killed. Yes, these are all poor people. If you notice the pattern, these are all poor people. The post-COVID world will be built on the dead bodies of the poor, not just in the sense of this whatever I've talked about explicitly. Look at the online education scenario. Who are the people able to afford online education? There was a girl who committed suicide because she could not access the internet. Now we talk about we often say, oh, students obviously they can access Facebook and WhatsApp, so obviously they have internet access. That's not always the case. There are many places where the students can't even make a call, let alone take an internet class. There are places where smartphones, they use their parents' smartphones for half an hour a day or 1 hour a day. And what about a situation where there are two children in a house? One happens to be a boy and one a girl. The boy's education will definitely be given a certain kind of privilege over that of the girl. So, what happens to the women in the country? What happens to these people who cannot access the internet? Okay, we are building this economy, we are trying to build an economy where only the fittest survive. This is a kind of a Darwinian economy where we emphasize on the survival of the fittest, and those who are weak, those who are aged, those who are disabled, women, they are all pushed to the margins. This is a post-COVID world which we are moving into. This is a post-COVID world where the government is going to withdraw from jobs from the public sector. Privatization is going to increase, and along with it exploitation. And who are the people who get exploited? These are again the nation's outcasts who are getting affected. So yes, the post COVID world is one where we need to react, otherwise it's going to be a changed world.
So aptly
Thank
put,
you.
yes, PL, any other questions? No.
Yeah, there's one more question. I think it would be very unfair not to put it across. This
Okay.
is from Shagufta Anjum. She writes, what would you like to say about those people who think Muslims, if lower class, as hawkers and vegetable vendor, as a burden and abuse to the nation? So she's asking for Dr. Nina's opinion on people who think Muslims as lower class and hawkers and vegetable vendor as a burden and abuse to the nation.
I did get the question. She's talking about Muslims and lower caste as burdens.
Yeah, as
Yes.
burden, abuse to the
Perception
nation.
of, okay,
Yeah, she would like
perception
to
of.
know your opinion on that.
Okay. On the perception, yeah, that is what, like they are considered as those who do not belong. Now, the anti-Muslim sentiment existed in India, well, from the time of the partition. Let's be even before the time of the partition, if we are to be honest. Okay. Now, there were instances where there was an instance where Jinnah said, if you're a Muslim and you stay in India, your loyalties will constantly be questioned, which has come out to be true to some extent. And and the migrant laborers, the poor people, fruit sellers, they are indeed considered the burdens of the nation, who survive on the taxes paid by the so-called wealthy, fit kind of people. Now, all that has been happening in recent years point to this. Look at, as I said, the abrogation of Article 370. Look at the way in which certain states have been absolutely silenced, with no possibility of expressing dissent. Look at the way in which students who are protesting against the CAA were absolutely silenced. Okay. Look at the way in which the government refuses to accept that they are deeming some people as disposable, because the state does not even feel the need to explain itself. The state itself takes it as an understood fact that certain people are to be thrown outside the system. And add to it, look at how institutions get an instance is that of some institutions getting the Institute of Eminence tag when they do not even exist, which point to the increasing privatization that is happening in the education sector. The government is everywhere, so that itself functions on the logic of exclusion of certain groups of people. Yes, not just today it is the Muslims and the lower caste people. Tomorrow it could be Christians. Then next it could be transgenders. It could be disabled people. Like I said, we are moving into a Darwinian sort of an economy where the survival of the fittest is emphasized, and the others are considered disposable as burdens to the nation.
Okay, thank you, Dr.
Okay,
Minu.
so shall we round
Thank
up?
you.
I think, yeah,
Yeah, I
we
think
kind of,
That was an
we're
excellent
running out of
session. You
time.
know how the disease of the body lays bare the disease state of affairs. Uh, Loved your session. Thank you so much for joining with us. Okay, so should we end the broadcast now?
Yeah, thank you, Meenu, for joining us here. Thank you, Professor Fraser, for joining us here today. And we will
Okay.
shortly end the broadcast. And I would just like to share this personal comment that it's really overwhelming to having watched you so closely for the last decade to have and to see the wonderful researcher and person that you have grown into. It's just a pleasure. Thank you so much, Meena.
Thank you, everyone. I enjoyed the session. Bye.
Bye bye.
Okay, so we are ending the broadcast now. We will begin another broadcast shortly.